Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Flexible Working, Increasing Engagement, Decreasing Emissions. My name is Cinda Broad, and I'm the Community Manager for the Employee Engagement Working Group here at 2 Degrees, and your host for this webinar. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Gareth Rice of O2 and Ben Kellard of Forum for the Future, who will be presenting today. In today's presentations, there will be some time to address any questions you may have. You can ask a question to me at any point by typing into the Q&A box, bottom right-hand side of your screen, and pressing send. From the drop-down menu, just select to send the message to the host, and I'll get right back to you. Over to Gareth for the first part of today's session. Over to you, Gareth.
Very much. Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gareth Rice. I work in the sustainability section of O2, and Lucinda had asked me to talk to you today for about 15 or 20 minutes around sort of flexi working and like the O2 experience of flexi working before handing over to Ben Kellard from Forum for the Future, who's going to talk a little bit about involving employees and the processes and procedure behind all of this. To give you a quick overview of what I wanted to run through today. I should say, actually, flexi working within O2 is part of our wider sustainability initiatives that we've been running since about 2008, as we try to embed sustainability more fully within the core of the business under our Think Big program. But I guess the three things I'll try and cover in the next 15 or 20 minutes is a little bit of sort of setting out and the sort of the background to sort of flexible working within Telefonica UK, or O2 as we're more widely recognised as. And I'll tell you a little bit about an initiative we did earlier on this year on the 8th of February, which was, as we say there, a day of the office. And I'll then close by telling you a little bit about the story of what we've done since February of 8th this year, trying to further embed flexi working within O2's culture. Without any further ado, let me get on to setting out. This slide that you see just kind of gives you a quick overview of the sorts of things that we do within O2. Our office has been, I suppose, purpose-built towards the flexi working environment. Everything with sort of like open plan breakout areas, as you can see in the top right-hand corner, through to bookable meeting rooms in the middle, and the sort of like the open plan bookable desks that you can see in the bottom corner. A bit of a digression, but let's move straight on to our approach. One thing we need to say at the start of this talk is that flexi working for us isn't something new. We've had policies for a while, but one of the things that we learned a lot along the way is it's all very well having policies. It's very different to trying to move that into action on the ground. And we, as O2, had more than just policies. We've from dedicated car sharing spaces in our car parks through to showers for people who choose to bike or cycle or run into the office. We have season tickets to those who choose to come by train to our offices, not just in the southeast but across the O2 network. We have a bike scheme that we promote to our staff for discounted prices on bikes, and we do all of those plus more besides, everything from shuttle buses to expense-related incentives for travel. I think one of the things that we have benefited from as O2 is technologies. As an ICT company, that's to be expected. But one of the things we've also seen, not just within O2, but across the spectrum of the customers that we work with, is that everything from a BlackBerry to a telepresence unit can help you to work more flexibly, and technology is only one part of the equation. One of the things we have learned, and we'll talk a little bit about more as we go through this afternoon, is the importance of leadership from the top within O2. And the picture you can see on the screen here today is of Ronan Dunn, our CEO, who's quite personally supportive of the whole sustainability and indeed the flexi working agenda. And between himself and the board, that has helped us a lot. And I think the third thing that underpins our approach that we've realised is quite important is, I should expect, that whole aspect of communicating. O2 tends to be a very chatty organisation. We have everything from online and web communications to our people through to Yammer and social media internally, and then onwards into the cascading and line management cascade that you'd expect within an organisation. It's a background, but I think the two things to mainly talk about this afternoon are two stories. One is about a day, as we see here, day out of the office for this year, and the other one is kind of moving on from that. But let's talk a little bit about our great day out in February. The purpose of that was really to ourselves as an organisation that we could actually work flexibly. We knew that the Olympics were coming up in the summer of this year. We knew that we had invested in IT kit that in theory should be able to cope with a wide population of O2 working remotely from the office and use our technology and our wireless LAN networks to do that. What we did, led by our biz director and the board, was to say, okay, everyone in the Slough headquarters in Barter, try and work remotely on the 8th of February. We're going to prove to ourselves or otherwise that we can do this. And so the whole of the Slough quarter population, which is 2,500 people, were asked to work remotely for one day in February. And one thing we did find as we kind of started to look at this was actually, although everyone has the technology and in theory the capability to work flexibly, there was a sizable proportion of our population who weren't that familiar with the whole concept of flexibly working, and that was a challenge that we had to overcome, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But take a step back. One of the elements of this story that I should mention is our new head office. Before the Flexi Working Day this year, around about 2008 and 2009, we decided as O2 to, in essence, amalgamate what were three large offices in Slough into one single headquarter unit. We built that unit. We realised that we could better embrace flexi working within that. One things we found since building that unit is that it's embodied our flexi working capability, but it's also a very nice place to work. And in essence, we've become a victim of our own success, in as much as everybody wants to work at the headquarter office, and we some days found ourselves bursting at the seams with people. So basically, what actually happened? One of the things that we had done, just before I tell you about what happened, was as we developed our new headquarter office, we did a survey of desks within O2, and we found that on a typical day, anything up to 60% of the desks were unoccupied within our estate. We also calculated the sort of cost per desk to O2, and it worked out at about £7,000 per year per desk. So as we developed that new office, we had designed it with 25% less desks, and there should be people in that, and so it was an interest to push the flexi working approach. On as we ran up to the 8th of February, that there was a sizable proportion of our population that were less than comfortable with the technologies behind flexi working, as we basically operated workshops and training on a monthly basis for anyone who wanted to kind of get training and comfortable with the technology right across January of this year. So as February came in, people were reasonably confident with getting into the O2 systems remotely. Obviously, we had about 82% of our staff who actually worked from home. The 2,500 folks that work in our office, and only 125 actually did come in, and those were people who, from a network maintenance perspective, it was essential that they were there. We actually had only one person who failed to see all the emails, the posters, the online chat, and everything else, and did come into the office. We're not quite sure how he missed it, but he did. But overall, it was a reasonably positive result. And in terms of results, I think the most impressive thing that we found on that one individual day in February was that 88% of our people felt that they were at least as productive, if not more productive, on the day. And generally, a very large majority of our population were very confident and positive about flexi working experience. and they recognised that there was benefits to O2, but more importantly, there were benefits to themselves. And I think what primarily sold it to people on the day was the fact that work-life balance was something that they could actually address better, and that's something that people began to realise as we did that one-off event in February. You see there some of the quotes from people that were through Twitter and other social media channels on that day, and the talk of savings that people can achieve through this. And I think that's key to embedding any cultural change towards flexi working within the workplace. You have to be honest about it, but you also have to be able to sell it to people and what the benefits is to them over and above the benefits to the business. We'll come to that again in a minute. I think you said at the start one of the reasons for doing this was to prove to ourselves that the technology we had was capable of hosting a large-scale population working remotely, and the answer was that it did. Our systems coped admirably. What is more important to emphasize is not only did our systems cope admirably, but our people actually coped with the IT involved quite admirably, and they gained a level of confidence in that sense. And I think the last thing to mention on with regards to the 8th of February is the sustainability benefits. We did a piece of research on that day afterwards and realised that we'd saved 12.5 tons of carbon on that individual day. Our people who would have been coming on an average of 9 miles, 85% of those were sewing, and we saved 300 hours of wasted commuting time. That one day out of the office was seen to be a reasonable success. After that, actually, that came from the board was, okay, that's great, folks, that you've done that, but let's see if you can integrate that into business as usual. We need to do more, as the Olympics were looming at this stage in early March. And what we had done since March, and this is still an ongoing story, is trying to drive this further into business as usual. We formed a pan-O2 working group with representatives from every single directorate. Those same folks were involved in the 8th of February, and we continued that working group on to kind of drive this further into the business. We realised that it was in essence a full-time job, and like all of you in the call, I'm sure most of us have at least 2 full-time jobs, or it feels like that, and trying to find more time to do even more was going to be a struggle for us. And on that basis, we involved colleagues in the action plan to, in essence, help try and win engagement of our people and project manage the delivery of more integrated flexible working within O2. And one of the things we'd learned from the 8th of February, which was very key to the success we've had since, was the whole aspect of communication and developing innovative communication messages and innovative communications channels to kind of broadcast the results. We've now got communication messaging on flexible working on the barriers into the car park that thank people for flexible working as they come up to a barrier. We have very inventive and creative messaging in the toilet cubicles in O2, reminding people of whether the penny has dropped yet and why flexible working is good for you as well as O2. And there's a whole range of different communication styles that we've adopted. What we've done then since through April, May, June and July on to the present day is really a consistent campaign that's been driven by the working group and with the assistance of Global Action Plan, but with messaging that's come down very much from the top and cascaded through the CEO to the board members, and the board members into their direct reports, and through the organisation, through the different communications channels we've had. The challenge that we set our team and our people in March was based on an observation we'd seen since the February working day. People were very comfortable with working flexibly on a Monday and a Friday, but most people were in the offices on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays, and we wanted to try and change that. So we asked each of our directorates to pick a Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday that would be, if you like, their semi-official working day, and to try and keep with that as a team and drive it through the business. And the results that we've had to date, this represents the story as it was, if you like, at the end of March. And people, as we just kicked off phase 2 of flexi working, and again just at the end of August, beginning of September, and I think the results are quite impressive. At the February working working day, we saw 88% of our people gaining confidence in flexi working. By April time, that had reached about 92, and we've now reached a level where only 4% of our population feel less productive working flexibly than they do working flexibly. Moreover, and what particularly excites us is the number of people who are choosing to work remotely and flexibly more than once a week has significantly changed. We've now got upwards of 60% of our people working at least twice a week flexibly. And the level of confidence that people are experiencing on this has grown significantly. We won't pretend to have got licked. There are still pockets of resistance, and frankly, most of those pockets sit, if we're honest, with middle managers. It's certainly the desire of people, if you like, low down the food chain to work flexibly. They can see the work-life benefits for them in terms of picking up kids from school and sorting out the dry cleaning and arranging the plumbing and that side of things. And likewise, at a board level, who, by the nature of their board jobs, have to work flexibly anyway, but there are still some pockets of resistance within middle management that we're still trying to deal with. But if I can finish off very quickly and hand over to Ben, I think there are some conclusions that we've drawn and we're working on. One of them is that this do help. There's no doubt about that. Within O2, we do have a range of tools, everything from video conferencing and smart boards through to telepresence suites and remote access that have undoubtedly helped us. But the tools themselves are not really what the challenge is for organizations. You can work flexi and remotely via BlackBerry and a mobile phone, but it's not the tools themselves that help you. It's the training and the communication and the mindset. We realize how important ongoing training is now. We can't deliver this sort of thing without it. And as new people come in, we're constantly training people up to appreciate how to use the technology as best they can and to be a fit in it. But even more than the training, the messaging and the communication has to be key. And not just the messaging itself, but messaging from the top of the organization. I think there's a clear risk in some of these activities to do as I say rather than do as I do. And I think where we've had success on this, it's been much down to our board and our CEO to kind of champion it right from the very top of the organization and champion it and communicate it diligently and frequently. And the element I think we've learned is the mindset aspect of this, and actually to take it seriously, and everyone has to do this, because ultimately at the end of the day, the one thing that we realized since February of this year, and we need to appreciate, is that this isn't so much a process, this is actually a culture change. That I can't stress, it really is a culture change agenda. And as testimony to that, one of the things we're doing now within O2, recognizing that, is that the ownership of this has been transferred from the sustainability team into our HR director, because really that's where the culture change can really happen. I think that is a good time to hand over to Ben. If you do have questions, please use the online system to ask them, and we'll come back to that. In the meantime, what I suggest we do is hand over to Ben to explain a little bit around the rationale and background to this. Ben, are you okay with that?
Thanks. Yeah, so just before we open it up and take your questions, I wanted to really just zoom out really, and offer a bit of context and reflection on our experience of working with both O2 and other leading organisations who will sort of implement sustainability and go further and faster. So that's what I want to just share with you very briefly. So and looking at, so therefore, how can we organisations engage employees effectively? I think one of the things that's quite surprising is there's a lot of research showing the benefits of doing that. The Hague Group, for example, their research found that high engaged staff were 30% more productive than unengaged, disengaged staff. And the Sunday Times Best Company Survey has found there's a strong correlation between what can be loosely called CSR activities and the employment satisfaction and engagement of staff. So, and that, I think, bears out sort of anecdotal evidence from with our partners. So why aren't people really doing more? And following the example that O2 have provided. One of the issues is that the thing about change is that you don't always get what you expect. It can often surprise us. There's the law of unintended consequences, And as we know, organisational change and culture change is notoriously tricky. So what I want to really offer then is really an approach, which is an integrated approach to engaging employees and focusing on 4 areas, 4 key principles. So very briefly, the first one then is what's the sense of direction? What's your story? What's your narrative? As you can see, looking at the Lord of the Rings as a very strong story. But if you look at the case of O2, as Gareth mentioned, it's part of their wider Think Big approach, which was an internal brand they created to tell the story about sustainability, which was engaging, was consistent with their brand, culture and ethos. So, and I think what's important there is to be clear on what you're doing, how you're doing and why you're doing it as part of that story, and use existing channels that exist to get that story across. So the thing is really looking at how to then align that with performance. I think what's important here is aligning it with what are the, if you like, people management processes or touch points in your organisation. As I'm walking through this, I'd invite you just to be reflecting on your own organisations, thinking, yeah, what are we doing? Where are we strong? Where could we maybe be stronger? As I'm walking through this. Performance is around how do you really align what you're trying to do as an organisation with the individual. So a key part of that is, of course, setting performance objectives and linking that through to the reward mechanisms. And ideally what I call creating a clear line of sight between what I do as an individual, then what my team does, what my department does, what my business unit does, and what the group is trying to do. So that, and I can see the linkages between that. That's what I mean by a clear line of sight. So I think what that does is it then allows people to see where they fit in and how they can contribute. And so it's a bit like having all the arrows pointing in the same direction. So it's clarifying functional objectives. I think what's also worth thinking about is targeting key opinion formers. They may be people in formal roles, or it might be those individuals that people look to and have a lot of informal influence in the organisation and engaging them. And not underestimating the power of feedback and reward. So, giving individuals feedback when they are supporting the strategy, they are moving in that direction. And again, getting that back to O2, I think one of the things they're doing very effectively is that they've essentially integrated their Think Big approach, currently called the Blueprint, into their brand strategy, which also is then reflected into individual goals. As part of their performance. So that's where there's an alignment there. And as we were talking about also at the directorate level, so that's the main functions that make up O2, also taking a leadership role there and having flexible working days for that directorate and so on. There are other initiatives that the directorates are doing. The point is around capacity building. So what I call, if you like, joining up the dots. And that one of the things that, going back to O2, is in the example there, drawing that out, was the capacity building they did with 700 members of staff before the 8th of February. So they all felt comfortable, they knew all the kit that they had, and they felt more comfortable on how to use it. I think the key thing here around identifying who are those key populations that are going to be important in implementing your plan, your approach, your initiative, and this applies to whether you're implementing a sustainability strategy or a specific initiative like the flexible working one. We need it critical. Gareth talked about some of the middle managers, and we know that actually targeting leaders and being clear about what it means for them and how they manage their people and their teams is really important to think through and spell out that and what it means to them. And ways of delivering that through e-learning modules, you can use that, or existing training programs. But what it really help is, as well as joining the dots, are who are the people that need to be building and sharing experience together, and actually just giving them the tools and the permission to create networks. And that's either building on networks that already exist within the organisation, or enabling them to create new ones to share and develop how practice. Final, I think, principle there is around involvement, where people can make it their own. And so this is, if you like, a combination of the top-down, so the top-down being the setting the direction, having the strategy and the strategic areas, and so setting it into performance objectives. But then the bottom-up element is enabling teams and individuals, as I say, to really make it their own, having shared the strategy with them, and then to find what does local solutions look like. And so again, whether that's directorates choosing, in the case of flexible working, with O2 directorates choosing their flexible working days, or whether that's individual teams deciding which team meetings they're going to run virtually, and so on, is all part of that. But I think taking the principles of what is the strategy or the initiative trying to achieve, and giving them room to interpret and apply that locally, and so not falling into the trap of feeling that you have to have all the answers for them. Actually allowing them to create the answers, first of all, will be most appropriate to their local context, but secondly will increase their sense of ownership because they've been able to adapt it locally. Also thinking about, is it worth identifying champions or networks, which is a great way of identifying and sharing best practice, because what we know is that peers are very much influenced by peers, is a very powerful way of influencing people, as opposed to being told from on high. And having people locally within teams, within different sites, who could be a go-to person for advice and recommendations. In O2's case, they've got what they call big thinkers, who provide that role, again, as sort of go-to people. So really, that's just a very brief overview, really, of I think drawing out, to say, some principles that you might want to reflect on, and think, what might that look like in your organisation, for an initiative you're driving, or, as I say, applying a sustainability strategy. I'd like to pause and really hand this over to Lucinda and yourselves to ask us any questions, or indeed share reflections as well. It'd be really great to get your insights. I know you've lots of experience for dialing in on this, and if you could share those as well, that would be terrific as well. So over to you.
Great, thanks, Ben. So as Ben just mentioned, we're moving on to Q&A session, and if you'd like to ask a question, as I said before, just type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you could let me know who your question is for as well, that would be great. Okay, so we're going to start with our first question, which is from Jessica, who says, did O2 trial flexi-working by enabling staff to work different shift patterns, or was it focused on different locations?
Jessica, that's a very good question. With regards to the February activity and since then, which is focused on Slough, that's mostly been location-based. But the other thing that we have to recognise with flexible working is it's exactly your point. It's not just about location. It's also about working different hours and different shifts. We do have folks obviously in our retail and service centres, and they embrace flexible working too. It's in a different concept though. We've just had the holiday of Eid, for example, at the moment, and a lot of it's actually Ben's point about making people feel that these things are their own. A lot of our people within those call centres will trade amongst themselves, saying, "Well, look, I'd like to have Eid off if I can work Christmas. Will someone trade with me?" And we that's all part of flexible working too. So both elements happen. What I've been focusing on this morning is more, if you like, the location-based element of flexi working, but flexi working is more this location.
Great, Gareth. So we've got a second question from Jessica, who's, why were there concerns with middle management, and how are O2 managing these concerns?
I think that's another interesting point, and I think it's not just unique to O2. I think, as I said in the talk, what we've realised more than anything else is this isn't so much about technology and training, it's more about culture shift. There is a mindset within some folks in organisations that, I expect my staff to, be on seats. I want to see the back of their heads. I want to know that everybody is working. And I think one of the things we've struggled with, and everyone seems to struggle with, is the breaking of that perception and kind of saying, look, it's not about, in essence, bums on seat. It's about productivity, and can we look at how productive people are being. The way we have tried to tackle that is again coming from a bottom up and a top down approach. Jessica, what we have done is we communicated to our people saying, look, if you do find that your manager is if you like, being awkward in terms of supporting your approach to flexible working. This is our policy. The flexi working team will try and work that for you, or contact your director. All of the directors are fully on board on this. And we did a two-pronged attack. So working around the obstacle and empowering people by letting them feel that there is someone above the obstacle that can help them with the obstacle, if that helps answer your question.
Bev, anything to add to that?
I just wanted to, first of all, Gareth, thanks for being frank about the culture shift. And I think that's something I definitely recognise with other organisations we work with, is that there is that sort of really, I think there's quite a fundamental shift actually taking place around the style management from that sort of more controlled top-down style approach to a more distributed leadership format where people can work, and it's more about that shift also from input outputs and work remotely, and that's for that sort of wider skill sets I think that often managers need in order to feel comfortable, of which flexible working is a part. So I think I'd sort of like to say, it's part of that wider shift in skills acquired from leaders working in more distributed, flatter, distributed organisations, and it does require skills, and that's where leadership development can help support leaders and managers in that transition.
So moving on to our next question now, we've got one from Eddie, who says, given the speed of technological improvement, do you think that one day in the future people will be working without offices altogether? Ben, do you want to have a go at answering that?
That's because we've a large part of what we do is looking at the future and future trends that we've looked at. And I think certainly, and I think what we're likely to see is more flexibility of both working at home, having certain roles for head offices. And I think what's interesting is around the sort of cultural brand implications of that, of actually working together and having that common sense of brand experience, if you like, maybe at head offices. But then also I can see hybrids in between where you might have, for example, regional shared office spaces, which are where you can, for example, hold video conferences, have printers and those sort of office facilities you'd have at home, but where you can share ideas, but with other people from other organisations. So as if you're like a hybrid between working at home and working in the central office. So I can imagine, if you like, a number of different services emerging, and we've already starting to see that as, if you like, an early indicator. Places like the hubs are setting up where they're primarily aimed at entrepreneurs who can share office space, share ideas, share some office equipment. But I think, yes, certainly a lot more of that as technology becomes more enabled and ubiquitous. Gareth, anything you want to add from your work with sort of future trends and thinking?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Ben. I would say, Eddie, I don't think the office has totally had its day just yet. I think we've seen from our experience that there's still a need for face-to-face meetings. We couldn't pretend that our solution has been perfect, but as Ben said, we're actually kind of seeing that ourselves in terms of actually trying to use our headquarter office more for kind of those essential meetings and to try and enable teams to kind of meet virtually more frequently. And I think one of the other things that we've realised and we're learning is actually there's an etiquette to flexi working and remote meeting that people need to appreciate as well, in terms of make sure your line's on mute if you're having if you're not on the conversation, making sure that people are on time, making sure your kit is on when it's meant to be on, and those sorts of things. But generally, I think as more and more technology comes along, the telepresence suites, for example, that we have in O2 are very impressive and allow us to have pretty much the equivalent of face-to-face meetings with colleagues in Prague and Madrid and elsewhere around the globe. I think I'd like to think, in decades ahead, when the technology really is split, maybe the office will have its day, but it still has a role at the moment.
Thanks, Gareth. So our next question is from Mark, it's really interesting to hear about O2's experience. Do Ben or Gareth know if there is a movement movement to more flexi working in the big company sector, and this is led by only CSR, sustainability agendas, or also health and well-being. Who leads it everywhere else? Is it HR? So who wants to have a go at that?
I can kick that one off. Yeah, a good question. I think picking up on the point I was making earlier, I think what's really driving it, what I'd see more around the sort of globalization of large organisations, of course, SMEs as well. And I think it's more how we're seeing more distributed virtual teams, and I'd say that's probably the major driver of new technologies, new ways of working, and I think that's bringing with it this sort of new skill set and a new way of approaching leadership, where that sort of needing to see people, as Gareth said, the backs of heads, and being in high levels of control are actually really counterproductive in that sort of context. So, and not only I think within large multinational organisations, having virtual teams working on projects where they may never meet face to face, but also how you're then recruiting into that virtual teams. So we're seeing, for example, people using LinkedIn purely to recruit virtual teams. So I think we're seeing that as part of that trend. But also, as organisations wanted to do more or less, stripping people out. We all know that most organisations, you've got people trying to do 2 or 3 jobs, working, greater geographical spreads. All of that's putting more pressure on individuals to work more efficiently and effectively. So I'd say, from my perspective, that's really what's driving this. You're getting some leading HR departments around leadership development, trying to, I think, equip and enable the kind of culture change and skills to go along with that. And I think what's really good to see is when you start to see that combining with the sustainability initiative to say, how can this actually drive down our environmental implications, but also ask the wider question, what sort of culture is this creating, and how can we create a high performance culture in this context, rather than just simply sweating the assets through that transition, and asking that sort of wider question of what that needs to look like, and bringing the right technology and skills along to enable that transition.
And I think I would just add to Ben's point, Mark, by saying this. I think we're finding that it's kind of a shared leadership on this within any organisation. It is, in my view at least, primarily culture shift, so that lends itself to HR. But I think overall, we've seen a shared approach is better. I think one of the 2 observations I would also make on this are this. First of all, we've realised how important it is to be straight up and honest with people. There are limited cost savings to flexi working, and if you try and hide those from your employees by saying it's all about living the green dream, people see through that pretty quickly. So, my message is beat up with people and tell them about the cost savings, because that is a fundamental driver. But don't forget to tell them about the benefits to themselves. We did a very interesting piece of research with University College London a few years ago, looking at how flexi working changes people's attitudes and performance within the O2 workplace. And the things we found was that the folks who were involved more with flexi working had a sick leave and illness within work. They had a higher performance at work. They also had a higher regard for the organisation, and those who were on flexi working, the churn or staff turnover is lower as well. And the feedback that we got from those folks a few years ago is the same as we've recently, is that if you trust me and let me kind of work the way that is best for me, you'll get more out of me, but you'll also, I'll have more respect and more loyalty to you. So I think that the message that we have come back is that it is a triple bottom line saving, but we need to be honest with our people that there's savings that are, at the bottom of this for O2 as well as just doing the right thing.
If I could just build on that point, an interesting piece of feedback we've had from one of our other partners is that also employees want to know what the business rationale and business benefits are, because they obviously have a long-term interest in the organisation. So when they want to see and actually really appreciate where that's leading to, greater competitiveness, bottom line savings, and so on. So the idea that employees are only interested in their immediate impact, I think is challenging that assumption really, and giving employees the credit of that a wider interest and picture. So I think, as Gareth mentioned, that's why beneficial for them to see the wider knock-on benefits.
Great. Moving on, we've had a few questions coming in about how to get the senior management team on board. So John, for example, has asked how critical was the support and visual support of the senior management team, and what was the key message saying it to them?
If I can quickly answer that question, John, with a story. It's a story that involves Ronan, our CEO, and a volcano in Iceland. Of the stories that our CEO tells is that, one of the things that he has to do as the leader of Telephonic in the UK is there's regular European meetings once a month that migrate between London, Madrid, Prague, Berlin, and a couple of other places in Europe. And one of his regular Monday morning meetings, he found that he couldn't go to one of these meetings because a most inconvenient volcano had blown up in Iceland. Instead, what they did was they arranged to have the meeting by telepresence and video conference. And what sold Flexi Working to Ronan and what it sold it to the other CEOs across Europe that day was that most of them were in a similar position to Ronan with, teenage and younger children. And they found that particular Sunday night they had more time with the family. They didn't have to get up for the red-eye flight on the Monday morning. The meeting finished in time and they were home with their families and kids that night on Monday night as well, which hadn't happened in months. And the story was around the virtual meeting room, around this video conference. They were all saying, we should do this much more often, and they do now do it much more often by video conference. And that's that's one of the engagement levels for our board members. Your fundamental question was how important is that? And I think from a perspective in our experience in O2, it really is important, because if it is a case of do as I say and don't do as I do, it simply won't work in the organisation. And I think the reason why we've had the success we've had, if we have had any over the summer of this year, is because consistently the messaging has been coming down from the CEO and from the board members themselves into their teams to make this happen.
Just build on that in terms of just drawing on other experience as well. I mean, I think O2 is in a great position where it's been very much led from the front by the CEO and the directors. I think where you're in a situation where you don't have that advantage, the sorts of things that seems to work well is, as you'd expect, start with where the organisation is, try and use the language and strategic goals and objectives the organisation has, drawing on that context, and work back from that. So you're not using the terms carbon savings or sustainability at all, you're framing it in whatever the language the organisation is using, and that can be one sort of powerful way to start and selling the ideas in. I think the other thing is trying to press a number of different buttons. So take flexible working, staying with that, talking about both, if you like, the soft benefits of greater work-life balance, increased feelings of and performance and so on, as well as also the hard, talking about the cost savings and so on and so forth, and trying to use as many different, if you like, buttons to press, and you'll inevitably will trigger some for some and not for others. So that's the other thing that can work well. One of the cunning devices I have come across before is to get your exec team or some very important influencers and get them to do something very visually symbolic, like, for example, going out and emptying all of the recycling to sift through recycling, or visibly collecting recycling, whatever the scheme might be, in this case working fully. Smiles on their faces, and you can come back because, well, why wouldn't they? And then have a photograph, even for those that sort of aren't maybe fully on board, but they wouldn't deny that photo opportunity or feel could, and then use that as, if you like, a calling card, because then it implicitly says to the organisation, the top team are on board, so why wouldn't you be? So quite a sort of powerful bit of messaging there. A little devious, but it worked for that organisation in mind. So there are some other tricks you can deploy.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our final few questions now. We've got a question from Tim, who says, do you measure other benefits, such as carbon reduction, and how do you report on them?
Tim, the answer to your question is yes, we do. We have developed a range of metrics on this. At the moment, the metrics come from two sources. One is kind of around the organisation and particularly around Slough ourselves, getting anecdotal and individual feedback from people. The other way we have looked at this, and we've done this in the past, is through our expenses profile. We developed a system within O2 about 18 months ago, whereby we now have information from our fleet management company against each of the company cars in terms of their CO2 emissions. We also have from our travel management company information on the CO2 emissions with flights and travel booked through them. And we also get from the train line information on carbon performance against train journeys. So what we've now actually been able to do as an organisation is to, for against each individual's expense report, actually map their carbon performance, and that allowed us to set targets and drive change. One of the best examples of that was our business and sales team, where they set themselves an internal competition to drive change within that team, and the winner got a very nice, very expensive weekend in an eco hotel in Cornwall, which I've never been to, but did look fabulous, I have to say. And that did drive change and incentivize people within those teams. So you do have KPIs, and we're trying to use them as much as we can to encourage people down this route.
Gareth. Next question is from Lynn. Gareth mentioned that the impending Olympics were a major motivator for the flexible working initiative. Would it have happened without the Olympics?
I think that's a good question too. I think it probably would have. Coming back to the preceding question about, or bar one, about kind of driving change and how to do it without board support. I think one of the things that helped us to drive change was kind of like a dip your toe in the water approach in the first instance. That February day, the working remotely day on the 8th of February was easier for the people to get their heads around. It was just an isolated moment in time. It was just one day, and although it was 2,000 people working remotely, it was at individual level it was easy to kind of get people on board. And I think that one day was very powerful in its own right, because it made people think, and people came out of that day kind of going, actually, this is great because I got an hour back in my life, and I was able to pick the kids up, or I didn't have any of those interruptions that I usually get in a day-to-day event in the office. I got much more done, and it kind of brought people on board in, if you like, a softly approach that meant when we kind of tried to do more, people were familiar with it and comfortable with it and weren't daunted by the challenge that we set. So without doubt, the Olympics helped. It was a landmark, and we were hearing voices externally about what it was like in London and in the home counties. But I think we'd still have done it because we'd always kind of driven ourselves towards that ambition.
Okay, so our next one is, I think we touched on it earlier, around middle management. So Mark says, we work with companies in Cambridgeshire, and often that they say that there is a middle management tier that finds it difficult to let go of presenteeism. Idea on how to break through this barrier? Ben, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think each of the sort of four principles I spoke about, I think would help. I think probably as I'd maybe zero in on particularly nuance around that is around a combination both in terms of performance, setting some clear expectations around the need to shift management styles and what that looks like. So this shift from say in managing input to output, for example, but then the capacity building, actually what support they might need to help them in that transition. The reality is we know that we're social animals, so the way really culture change happens is when we see people around us that we see are like us changing their behaviour, then we tend to follow suit. That's the kind of reality of how often behaviour changes. So actually I think also other ways of looking at how you can engage with that middle management tier, whether that's through focus groups, piggybacking meetings that they're already having. Do they convene as, say, sales teams or as middle management meetings, or say, leadership conferences, that sort of thing. Find those sorts of opportunities to where you can try with them, see it coming from, reiterate where the organisation is trying to get to, or the shift it's trying to achieve, and trying to distill down, what are those sort of skills and tools to help them manage that transition. And you can draw on those sponsors within the organisation, preferably, obviously, from the senior team if you can, but if not, really driving the sort of, what the benefits are. So I think, probably to say, drawing on the kind of performance, setting clear expectations, and the capacity building is the one I'd sort of particularly suggest focusing on in that instance.
So to our final question, which is from Eddie. It seems that top-level CEOs of large organisations understand the long-term cost savings and CSR sustainability message, but it's harder to convince SME businesses to adopt more flexible working, mainly due to their mindset. How do you go about convincing them? Are you able to answer that one?
I think the way to do it is kind of through the testing the toe in the water approach. You kind of just do a small trial and prove the benefits of it. And I think the other way to do it is to look at other SMEs who are doing this too, and who are actually working flexibly. There's quite a few within the ITC sector that we come across who by the nature of where they're working and where they're working from, that empowers them anyway. So I think it's a combination of kind of testing something simple that can prove the point and to kind of get back on that, and then using champions as Ben has alluded to in previous answers to kind of show that it can be done. Ben, I don't know what to add to that.
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons, I think, with the SME context, because I think the difficulty is a lot tends to rest on the kind of the founding figure or the in terms of organisational structure. Often you have quite centralised organisations, but also quite informal, typical for SMEs. And so, if you like the spider at the centre of the web, there's usually one in an SME or a handful of very influential people, and they're the sort of really critical to tackle and change their views. Once they do, the advantage that they have over a large organisation is, of course, they can change much more rapidly because they don't have the same numbers, they don't have so much of typically formal processes that they need to change. That's the advantage. And so I think trying to, again, start with where they're at. What are the sort of drivers for those individuals? Again, typically for SMEs, a lot of it's built around, marketing, sales, and that's often what's driving it. Again, looking at so how can you link in the benefits to that? Tell them stories of how of other SMEs or very entrepreneurial people are adopting this sort of thing and the benefits. So telling stories is always powerful, and particularly trying to pick peers that they look up to and would identify with. And I think so then linking it back to the business benefits, how it will, provide, great lessons that they can pass on to their customers. That's something that, O2 done. They've taken their learning, for example, they've shared it with their customers, to say a lot of which are SMEs. Share that sort of learning. How can the organisation benefit from doing that? How can it help them, get their sales team to be even more productive and, free up capacity? So bring those links back to what they already value and the, if you like, frame of reference that they've already got, as opposed to seeing it something that's worth doing in and for itself, linking it into their existing kind of values frame and set of objectives that they hold for themselves. I think would be probably what I'd suggest the starting point there.
Thanks. Okay, that's all we've got time for now. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar and for all your great questions and comments. Special thanks to Gareth and Ben for their great presentations. All board members will be able to access the recording of this webinar in the Employee Engagement Working Group on 2 Degrees, and I'll be sending you out an email with that link in it in the next couple of hours. So thanks again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Lucinda.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.